The December wind cut through the cracks of the wooden barracks, carrying with it the sharp bite of winter. Outside, the ground was hard with frost, the fences glinting faintly in the pale light. The German prisoners huddled in their coats, the breath of 100 men mingling in the air like smoke. Inside, the barracks were dim, their pot-belly stoves glowing faintly, fighting a losing battle against the cold. The men sat on bunks or makeshift stools, their faces drawn and hollow. Most had stopped counting the days since their capture, but someone quietly whispered that Christmas was near. The word sounded strange, almost foreign, in a place like this. Christmas was bells and candles, snow falling on quiet villages, the warm smell of bread and pine. Here, it was barbed wire, distant guards, and a sky that seemed too big and too empty. No one expected anything to change. The Americans were not cruel, but neither did they go out of their way to offer comfort. Rations were steady, the rules were clear, but there was nothing festive in the way the camp moved. When a young soldier muttered that perhaps they would get better food on Christmas, an older sergeant scoffed. "Christmas? You think the enemy cares about your holidays?" The barracks went quiet after that. Most men turned inward, staring at the floorboards, thinking of their families across the ocean. Somewhere in Cologne, a mother might be kneeling by a small tree, lighting a single candle and whispering a prayer. In Dresden, a wife might be digging through rubble for firewood, clutching the memory of a husband she had not seen in years. The men wondered if they were even remembered. The war had taken so much, friends, homes, certainty, that hope itself felt dangerous. To hope was to risk breaking all over again. Yet as the days ticked by, subtle changes began to appear. One morning, a truck rolled into the compound carrying crates that were quickly taken to the mess hall. No one was told what they contained, but rumors spread fast. Some said it was extra rations. Others whispered about tobacco or coffee. When a guard entered the barracks and asked for a group of volunteers to help decorate, the men stared at him in disbelief. "Decorate what?" one of them asked. The guard only smiled and said, "You'll see." Suspicion ran through the room. For many of these soldiers, Christmas had been twisted into a propaganda tool back home, a time to promise victory and loyalty to the Reich. The idea that the enemy would celebrate with them seemed absurd, maybe even insulting. Still, a few men stood, curious enough to follow. In the mess hall, the sight that greeted them stopped them cold. Someone had dragged in a small pine tree from the woods nearby and set it upright in a stand. It was bare, its needles dusted with frost, but it was unmistakably a Christmas tree. Crates lay open on the floor, filled with simple paper garlands, a handful of glass ornaments, even a few candles. The American sergeant in charge handed the prisoners pieces of colored paper and string and motioned for them to help. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, hesitantly, one of the younger men bent to pick up a garland. The sound of scissors and the rustle of paper soon filled the hall. Men who had been silent for weeks found themselves cutting shapes, twisting strips of red and green. It was clumsy work, but something warm began to stir in the air. A man from Bavaria hummed under his breath, an old carol from his village. Others joined in softly, their voices uncertain at first, then growing stronger. By the time they returned to the barracks that evening, news had spread through the camp. A tree had been put up. There would be candles, perhaps even music. Some men still refused to believe it. "A trick," one officer muttered. "They want us to forget we are prisoners." But even he found himself glancing toward the mess hall, as if unable to stop his curiosity. The next day, the Americans distributed small parcels, one for each man. Inside were items so ordinary they almost hurt to look at. Nuts, a piece of chocolate, a few cigarettes, even a small orange. The orange in particular struck the prisoners. For many, it was the first fresh fruit they had seen since before the war turned Germany into a land of ration cards and empty shelves. One man held it in his hands for nearly an hour before peeling it, just breathing in the sharp, sweet scent. When he finally tasted it, tears rolled silently down his face. On Christmas Eve, the camp took on an atmosphere that no one could have imagined even a week earlier. The mess hall was swept clean. The tree stood glowing with candles, and tables were laid out with what food the Americans could spare. It was not a feast, but there was meat, bread, even coffee. The prisoners filed in slowly, their boots crunching on the floor, their eyes drawn to the flickering light. For a moment, it felt as though they had stepped into another world, a world where the war did not exist. Some sat rigid, afraid to let the moment touch them. Others folded their hands and bowed their heads. A chaplain, invited by the American officers, stood at the front and said a few words in halting German about peace and hope. No one knew whether to look at him or away. When the first hymn was sung, the sound was thin, almost fragile. But it did not break. Verse after verse rose into the cold air, filling the hall with something the prisoners had not felt in months: belonging. Afterward, the men lingered, reluctant to return to the barracks. Some exchanged pieces of their parcels, trading chocolate for cigarettes or saving the orange to eat on Christmas morning. Others sat in small groups, talking quietly about their families. For once, no one spoke about the war. No one cursed the enemy. The guards, standing back, seemed to understand that this night was not about them. It was about the prisoners remembering who they were before they became soldiers, before they became numbers in a camp ledger. As the candles burned low, a young man approached the tree and stood there silently. He thought of his village, of the church bells that would be ringing now if the steeple had not been destroyed. He thought of his mother's hands lighting candles just like these. In that moment, the barbed wire outside seemed far away. For a few hours he was home. When the lights were finally extinguished and the men trudged back through the snow, they did so quietly, almost reverently. The camp was still a prison. Tomorrow would be another day of fences and roll calls. But something had shifted, however small. The memory of that tree, those candles, the taste of chocolate on the tongue. It was enough to remind them that they were still human. And for men who had nearly forgotten that fact, it was a kind of salvation. The morning of Christmas Day came quietly, as if the whole camp was holding its breath. Frost clung to the barrack windows in delicate patterns, and the first light of dawn spilled across the compound in a pale, forgiving glow. One by one, the prisoners stirred, not to the sound of shouted orders, but to a silence that felt strangely gentle. There was no early roll call, no clanging of boots on the frozen ground. The guards seemed to move differently, too. Their usual clipped efficiency softened, their faces unreadable behind the steam of their coffee. For a brief moment, it felt as though the war had been pushed back beyond the horizon. Inside the barracks, a man unwrapped the orange he had saved from the night before. The sweet, sharp scent filled the room, drawing others closer. They sat in a loose circle on the floor, sharing pieces of bread, passing around their parcels again as though it were a sacred ritual. Some of the men spoke quietly of Christmases past, of snow-covered villages, church bells ringing across fields, children singing carols by lantern light. For a few minutes, their voices painted pictures so vivid that one could almost hear the bells again, almost smell the roast goose and the fresh pine branches from home. Then the voices would trail off, each man retreating into his own memory, his own ache. By mid-morning, they were called to the mess hall once more. The tree still stood, its candles newly replaced, its garlands bright against the rough walls. A gramophone had been set up in one corner, and as the prisoners entered, music floated softly through the room. Not American marching songs, not the triumphant anthems of victory, but slow, old melodies that spoke of winter and longing. Some of the men stopped in the doorway, visibly moved. They had not heard music since their capture, not like this. For many, it was unbearable, like having a wound reopened, and yet none of them turned away. The Americans had done their best with the meal. There was real meat, a rare treat, and warm bread fresh from the camp kitchen. Coffee was poured freely, and even a bit of sugar was offered, the crystals catching the light like snowflakes. The prisoners ate slowly, almost reverently. For the first time in months, the food was not just sustenance. It was a reminder of how meals used to feel, something shared, something human. A young guard stood by the door, watching them with a look that was hard to place. Perhaps he was thinking of his own family, sitting around a table somewhere far from here. Perhaps he was wondering whether his brother was a prisoner too, in some camp on the other side of the ocean. When the eating was done, an American chaplain entered once more. He spoke only briefly, but his words were measured and soft, touching on the hope that peace would come soon, that the men here would one day go home. His German was halting, but the sincerity was unmistakable. Then he stepped back and waited. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, as if on some shared signal, one of the prisoners began to sing. It was a carol, simple and old, the kind that even the most hardened soldier had known as a child. Another voice joined, then another, until the entire hall was filled with song. The Americans did not stop them. Some stood very still, listening, their hands resting on their rifles, their faces caught somewhere between duty and something more tender. When the prisoners finished the last verse, the room was silent except for the faint hiss of the candles. Then, to everyone's surprise, one of the guards began humming a tune of his own, an English hymn. Slowly, shyly, the prisoners joined him, the two melodies weaving together, German and English overlapping in a fragile harmony. It was not perfect, but it was enough to make several of the men lower their heads and wipe their faces with rough hands. In the afternoon, the guards brought out a football. At first, the prisoners thought it was a joke, but then the gate was opened and they were allowed into the yard, two teams quickly forming. The snow had hardened to ice, making every step treacherous. But soon shouts and laughter echoed off the barracks walls. For that 1 hour, the camp ceased to be a prison. Men who had been enemies only weeks earlier now ran side by side, slipping, falling, cheering. The Americans watched from the sidelines, and even a few of them joined in, their rifles slung over their shoulders. No one kept score. The game ended when the ball flew too far and rolled against the wire. But by then no one cared. The prisoners walked back into the hall, flushed and smiling, their breath rising in the cold air like smoke. Evening came quickly, the sky darkening into a violet twilight. Once again the candles were lit, their glow soft and unsteady against the bare wood. One man pulled out a small harmonica he had hidden in his coat and began to play. The sound was thin but sweet, filling the silence between songs. A few men clapped quietly in time. Others just sat, their eyes fixed on the tree as though willing the moment to last. For some, the weight of what they were feeling became too much. A corporal from Bremen broke down suddenly, his shoulders shaking, muttering that he had not cried since he was a child. Another soldier placed a hand on his back and simply sat with him until he calmed. No one mocked them. In that space, even tears felt honorable. As the night wore on, the prisoners began to drift back toward the barracks. But they did so slowly, not wanting to let go of the warmth that had gathered in the hall. It was not just the warmth of the stoves or the candles. It was something harder to define. Something that lingered in the air long after the last notes of the harmonica had faded. For the first time in months, they had felt seen, not as enemies, not as numbers, but as men. That night, when they lay down on their bunks, the camp was quiet. Not the tense, suffocating silence of ordinary nights, but a calm, deep stillness. Outside, the sky was filled with stars, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled. The sound carried across the empty fields, wild and mournful, but also strangely beautiful. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was softer than usual. The men dreamed of home, of wives, children, parents, of warm kitchens and candlelight. Some even dreamed of peace, though none dared say so aloud. Whatever came tomorrow, whatever the war demanded next, this day had been theirs. A Christmas they had never expected, never dared to hope for, had found them here behind barbed wire, and that memory, they knew, would be one they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The morning after Christmas felt almost cruel in its normalcy. The whistles were blown, the roll call was called, and the men filed out into the biting cold as they always did. The guards' faces were once again masked in duty, their voices brisk and clipped. The tree in the mess hall was still standing, but its candles were burnt low, its once bright garlands sagging under their own weight. For a moment the prisoners stood outside, staring at the empty sky as if hoping to hold on to what had happened the day before. But the spell had been broken. The fences were still there. The guard towers still loomed. The war was still raging far away, and they were still on the wrong side of the wire. By mid-morning, new prisoners arrived. Thin, hollow-eyed men stepped off the truck, their uniforms torn, their boots caked with mud. They looked at the camp with a mix of suspicion and exhaustion, their bodies stiff as though braced for cruelty. The older prisoners watched them silently, remembering their own first day. The newcomers were gaunt, their faces drawn with hunger, their hands shaking. When one of them spoke, his words were ragged, almost bitter. He told of cities reduced to rubble, of firestorms in Hamburg, of endless bombing raids that turned night into day. He spoke of families fleeing through streets choked with smoke, of children clutching burnt toys, of churches collapsed into smoking ruins. The men in the barracks listened, their hearts heavy, their brief moment of peace cracking under the weight of the news. Some turned away, unable to bear the images these words painted. Others pressed for details, desperate for any scrap of information about home. One man asked if Cologne still stood, if its great cathedral had survived. The newcomer only shook his head slowly, his silence more terrible than any answer. Another asked if his town had been spared, and when the answer came, He sat down on his bunk and did not move for a long time. The camp, which had seemed almost light the day before, grew heavy again, like a room where all the windows had been shut. But something had shifted in the men who had been there through Christmas. They still felt the weight of despair, but they no longer let it crush them completely. When the newcomers sat hunched and silent, some of the older prisoners broke off pieces of their Christmas chocolate and placed them quietly in their hands. Others told them about the tree, the candles, the carols. At first, the newcomers did not believe them. How could the enemy have offered such kindness? But the garland still hung in the mess hall. The tree still stood. Slowly, the newcomers' suspicion began to soften. Perhaps, they thought, there was still some part of the world that had not been consumed by the war. In the evenings, the barracks began to fill with quiet conversation. The men told stories, real ones, not propaganda. They spoke of growing up in small villages, of fishing trips with fathers, of summer evenings when the church bells rang across the fields. The Americans did not stop them, perhaps sensing that these stories did more to keep order than rules ever could. When one of the newcomers revealed he had been a schoolteacher before the war, the others urged him to teach them again, just to pass the time. He began giving small lessons, writing words in the dirt with a stick, explaining poetry and mathematics by the light of the stove. Even those who had once been officers sat quietly, listening, grateful for anything that made them feel less like prisoners and more like men. Then, one night, an American guard slipped a folded newspaper under the barracks door. No one knew why he had done it. Perhaps he had simply grown tired of seeing them starved of news. The paper was tattered and weeks old, but the prisoners passed it around as though it were treasure. They pored over every word, even the advertisements. The headlines told of Allied advances, of German retreats, of entire divisions surrendering. Some of the men read with clenched jaws, their pride stung. Others read with grim resignation, sensing that the war's end was drawing nearer. For a few, the news was a strange kind of relief. The sooner the war ended, the sooner they might go home, if home still existed. That night, when the camp was quiet and the stars shone cold and bright above the wire, a small group gathered near the stove. One of the prisoners produced the harmonica again, its metal dulled from so many hands. He began to play, not a carol this time, but a slow, mournful tune. It wound through the barracks like smoke, curling into the hearts of everyone who heard it. One man began to hum softly. Then another joined, until a low, wordless chorus filled the room. It was not a song of victory or defeat. It was simply the sound of men reminding themselves that they were still alive. Outside, the guards patrolled as usual, their boots crunching in the snow. One of them paused near the barracks, listening. For a moment, he stood very still, then he adjusted his rifle and moved on. Inside, the prisoners kept singing, their voices rising and falling in the darkness. When they finally stopped, the silence that followed felt different. Not empty, but full, like the pause after a prayer. In the days that followed, the camp settled back into its rhythm. But the memory of Christmas lingered like a faint warmth. Even the newcomers, hardened by what they had seen, began to change. They no longer sat apart, but joined the others in their small rituals, sharing coffee, telling stories, humming along when someone sang. The tree eventually came down, its needles turning brittle and brown, but by then it no longer mattered. The men had carried the light inside themselves. When January winds came screaming across the compound, they huddled together near the stove, not just for warmth, but for the comfort of being near one another. The war still raged. The world outside was still burning. But inside the wire, something fragile but real had taken root. Hope, not loud, not reckless, but quiet and stubborn, had begun to grow. Winter dragged on, and with it came weeks of gray skies and frozen mornings. The camp had settled into its rhythm again, but beneath the surface, something had changed. The men still answered roll call, still lined up for rations, still slept on rough bunks, but there was a quiet strength about them now. They no longer stared at the ground as they walked. They spoke more, even laughed at times, their voices carrying across the yard like faint music. The memory of Christmas remained with them, not just as a single night, but as proof that even in a place built to contain them, they could still feel alive. Then, one icy morning in early spring, news came that shattered the stillness. Another newspaper appeared, this one more recent, its pages crisp and smelling of ink. The headlines screamed of Allied breakthroughs, of entire German cities surrendering, of Berlin itself being threatened. The prisoners gathered around as the paper was read aloud, their faces a mixture of disbelief, dread, and something else, a strange, tentative relief. Some clenched their fists, muttering that it could not be true. Others simply stood in silence, their eyes distant, as though they were already somewhere else. Days later, a truck arrived carrying American officers. Orders were shouted, papers were checked, and the prisoners were told that the war was nearly over. For the first time, the possibility of going home was real. It was not simple joy that swept through the camp. Joy was too small a word for what they felt. There was fear, too. Fear of what waited for them in Germany. Fear that the places they loved no longer existed, that their families were gone. But there was also something unshakable inside them, a hunger to see it with their own eyes, to step beyond the barbed wire and reclaim their lives. The Americans began preparing lists, processing each man, giving them medical checks, issuing papers. It took weeks. During that time, the prisoners found themselves watching the camp with new eyes. The fences that had once seemed like walls now looked almost fragile, temporary, as though they might vanish at any moment. The guards seemed different too, more human now that the end was in sight. Some even spoke openly with the prisoners, sharing cigarettes, swapping stories about farms and towns on opposite sides of the ocean. There were moments when the line between captor and captive blurred, until it was hard to tell who was comforting whom. Then one evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the snow pink, an American sergeant unlocked the mess hall and called the men together. Inside, the tree was gone, the decorations packed away long ago. But someone had lit the stoves and placed candles on the tables. The chaplain stood at the front once more, this time with a translator at his side. He spoke of endings and beginnings, of forgiveness and rebuilding. He told them that soon they would be put on trains and sent to the port, then back across the sea to the land they had left behind. His voice was calm, but the room was thick with emotion. When he finished speaking, no one moved for a long time. Then, from somewhere in the back, a man began to sing, not a carol, not a hymn, but a song about home. It was a rough, simple tune, one the men had sung on marches long before they became prisoners. Others joined, their voices filling the hall. Not with sadness this time, but with something fierce and unbroken. The Americans listened silently, some with their heads bowed. When the last note faded, the room was still except for the sound of someone quietly weeping. In the final days before departure, the prisoners carved small mementos from scraps of wood, bits of metal, anything they could find. Some made crosses, others carved tiny figures or initials. One man made a small wooden ornament, shaped like a tree, and passed it from hand to hand so that everyone could touch it, before he tucked it into his coat. "For next Christmas," he said softly, and no one laughed. When the trucks finally came, the men climbed aboard slowly, turning back to look at the camp one last time. The guard towers stood silent, the yard empty, the barracks gray against the pale morning light. It was still a prison, but it had been for one brief season something more. As the trucks rumbled away, the men sat in silence, each lost in his own thoughts. Some smiled faintly, others wept openly. One man kept his hands tightly closed around the orange peel he had saved since December, brittle and dry, but still carrying the faintest ghost of its scent. The road stretched out before them, and beyond it, a future they could not yet imagine. Some would return to ruins, some to graves, some to lives forever changed. But no matter what waited, they would carry with them the memory of that night when candles glowed on a pine tree in a place where they least expected it. They would remember the music, the laughter, the shared bread, the fragile peace that had settled over them like snow. Years later, when the war was only a shadow in their memories, many of them would still speak of it, not of battles or victories, not of fear or hunger, but of that Christmas, of the quiet kindness of strangers who gave them back, for a single night, the feeling of being human. And when they told their children and grandchildren the story, they would always end the same way, with the same words. It was the Christmas we never expected, and we never forgot.